So today I'm going to read my chapter 28 to Parker. Parker likes to listen to stories, and this chapter is called Valouche. Now you be good, Parker. Yes, you be good. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. "I have some wonderful news," she said. The children stopped what they were doing and looked up. They waited for Mrs. Jules to tell them the wonderful news. "You are a very lucky class," said Mrs. Jules. "Mrs. Walouche, the world-famous dancer, will be coming here to Wayside School. She will teach you how to dance." Everyone was still waiting for the wonderful news. "Isn't that exciting?" asked Mrs. Jules. "You will see her every Wednesday instead of going to gym." "Will the girls have to dance with the boys?" asked Jenny. "I suppose," said Mrs. Jules. "Gross!" exclaimed Leslie. "Yuck!" said Dana. "Will the boys have to dance with the girls?" asked Ron. "Obviously," said Mrs. Jules. "No way," said Eric Fry. "I'd rather dance with a dead rat," said Terrence. Everybody started talking at once about cooties and warts and how disgusting it was to dance with boys or girls. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell again and told them to settle down. "Mrs. Jules, I don't need to take dancing lessons," said Eric Bacon. "I already know how to dance." "Yes, Eric, I've seen you dance," said Mrs. Jules sarcastically. Eric Bacon was a great break dancer, but break dancing was no longer allowed at Wayside School. That was because every time Eric danced, he broke something. "Mrs. Walouche will teach you the grace and beauty of classical ballroom dancing," said Mrs. Jules. Everybody groaned. On Wednesday, they all headed down to their first dancing lesson, except Myron. Myron went to gym. "How come Myron never has to do anything?" said Jason. "I don't know," said Calvin. "I've been wondering that too." "Myron's father must be friends with the president," said Bebe. "I think Myron gave Mr. Kidswatter $1,000, said Todd. "No, I bet he's blackmailing Mrs. Jules," said Jenny. "How could he do that?" asked Benjamin. "Maybe he caught Mrs. Jules getting drunk," said Jenny. "And then she danced on top of her desk with a lampshade on her head, and Myron took her picture. And so now Mrs. Jules has to let Myron do anything he wants, or else he'll show the picture to Mr. Kidswatter." "That makes sense," said Mac. "Except if she had a lampshade on her head, how would Mr. Kidswatter know it was Mrs. Jules?" asked Todd. No one knew the answer to that. They entered the room on the second floor. "Welcome," said Mrs. Walouche, a strange-looking woman with bright red hair. It looked like her head was on fire. "My name is Miss Walouche. It's so wonderful to be here at Wayside School." She wore pink tights and a sparkling pink top. "I hope we will be friends, yes?" she asked. Nobody said a word. All around were red and green balls. There was also one yellow ball. This was the room where Louis kept the balls for lunch and recess. It was also the room that was always used for school dances. It was a ballroom. "So," exclaimed Mrs. Walouche, "who will be first?" Everyone tried to hide behind someone else. Mrs. Walouche put her hands on Ron's face. "What is your name?" she asked. "Ron," he squeaked. "Ronaldo," bellowed Mrs. Walouche, "King of the Gypsies." "I don't know how to dance," said Ron. "Dance?" said Mrs. Walouche. She looked very surprised. "We are not going to dance," she said. "We're not?" asked Ron. "No, Ronaldo," whispered Mrs. Walouche. "We are going to tango." She put her left arm around Ron's waist, Then she grabbed his left hand with her right and stuck it way out in front of them. Suddenly the music started. Mrs. Walush dragged poor Ron across the room as she stomped her feet in time to the music. Dump, 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 hey! When she yelled hey, she threw Ron up in the air and clapped her hands. Ron turned a somersault in midair, and then Mrs. Walush caught him. They tangoed back to where they started, and Ron's eyes were spinning in opposite directions. Hey, that looked fun, said Mauricia. Do me. Very well, said Mrs. Walush. She grabbed Mauricia and tangoed her across the room. Dump-da-dump-dump, dump-dump-da-dump-dump, hey! She threw Mauricia up into the air and clapped her hands. Mauricia turned a double somersault before Mrs. Walush caught her. They tangoed back to the front. My turn, said Terence. Mrs. Walush tangoed with Terence. The other kids stamped their feet along with Mrs. Walush. They all yelled, hey, at the same time and clapped their hands. One by one, Mrs. Walush tangoed with every kid in the class. The other kids danced with each other. Boys danced with girls. Girls danced with boys. They didn't care. Paul danced with Leslie. Dana danced with John. Terence danced with Rondi. Allison danced with Jason. DJ danced with Kathy. Todd danced with Joy. Hey, they all shouted. Of course, they weren't strong enough to throw each other up in the air. Instead, they just tried to trip each other and throw each other to the ground. Hey! Even Kathy was having fun. Hey! She shouted as she kicked DJ in the rear end. They also threw the balls at each other. Hey! Mrs. Walush began to get tired. Sometimes she didn't catch the children after she tossed them in the air. Dee Dee crashed to the floor. Wow, she said, this is more fun than any gym class we ever had. Hey! At last the music stopped. Dump-da-dump-dump-dump, dump-da-dump-dump-dump, and everyone yelled, hey, one last time. Mrs. Walush clapped her hands. Wonderful! Hey, come over here so you can see the camera. There you go. Wonderful, Mrs. Walush said. Fantastic! Oh, they all staggered out of the ballroom, cut up, bruised, and bleeding. What do you think of that? Next week, we waltz, Mrs. Walush called after them. So how did everyone like dancing, asked Mrs. Jules when they returned. Dance? Asked Ronaldo, king of the gypsies. We didn't dance. You didn't? Asked Mrs. Jules. No, said Ronaldo. We tangoed. Everyone cheered. It was wonderful, exclaimed Kathy. Fantastic, said Terence. Myron was sorry he had missed it. I can't wait till next Wednesday, said Todd. I think we put him to sleep. Look how cute he is when he sleeps. Okay, that was chapter 28. Walush. We'll have to ask Mrs. Cornman if she knows how to dance like that. Gym class. Okay, chapter 29 will be the lost ear. And I think we'll go ahead and read that now. Mrs. Jules was teaching the class about mammals. How all animals have hair. Bebe raised her hand. Is my father a mammal? She asked. Yes, all people are mammals, said Mrs. Jules. But my father doesn't have any hair, said Bebe. He's bald. Everyone laughed. Benjamin stared down at his desktop. He was very determined. Mrs. Jules would be handing out report cards at the end of the week. He had to tell her his real name before then. He raised his hand, but Mac also raised his hand. Sorry. Yes, Mac, said Mrs. Jules. I heard about a man who was getting his hair cut, said Mac, and the barber cut off one of the man's ears. See, the man had very long hair. I think he was a hippie, so the barber couldn't see his ear until it fell on the floor. Thank you, Mac, said Mrs. Jules. That was a very interesting story. I'm not finished, said Mac. When the barber saw the ear on the floor, he said, "Is that your ear on the floor?" And then the hippie said, "What? I can't hear you." So the barber showed him his ear. Then he called an ambulance to take the hippie to the hospital. Were they able to put his ear back on? Asked Todd. Well, see, said Mac, the doctors were all set to sew it onto his head. They were in the operating room and everything, but suddenly they couldn't find the ear. Man, they looked everywhere for it. Did they look under the operating table? Asked Joy. Yep, said Mac. It wasn't there. How about the bathroom? Said Eric Bacon. Maybe they lost it when they washed their hands. They looked. Wasn't there, said Mac. Did they leave it at the barber shop? Asked Jenny. Nope. Did they ever find it? Asked Allison. Yes, said Mac. But you'll never guess where. In the refrigerator, grumbled Mrs. Jules. Now, how would it get there? Asked Mac. Well, we really need to get back to mammals, said Mrs. Jules. Yes, Mark. Benjamin lowered his hand. My name's not Mark, he said. My name is Benjamin. Benjamin Nushmut, and I came from Hempleton, not Magadonia. Fine, said Mrs. Jules, but we were talking about mammals. Now, the whale is the largest mammal, even though it lives in the ocean. It is still a mammal, not a fish. Do whales have hair? Asked John. Yes, said Mrs. Jules. Dana laughed. A whale with pigtails, she exclaimed. Boy, I'd love to pull one of those, said Paul. Benjamin couldn't believe it. Did you hear what I just said? He asked. Yes, Benjamin, said Mrs. Jules. Well, don't you think I'm strange? Asked Benjamin. All this time you've been calling me by the wrong name and I never told you? Don't you think I'm crazy? No, said Mrs. Jules. Benjamin was getting upset. Well, don't you think it's a dumb name? Benjamin Nushmut? He looked around at his classmates. Doesn't anybody think I'm weird? No, you're not weird, said Sherry. I'll tell you what's weird. What's weird is bringing a hobo to school for show and tell. I'm the one who's weird. That's not weird, said Bebe. What's weird is telling everyone you have a brother when you don't. I'm the weird one. You call that weird? Exclaimed Stephen. I'm the weird one. Who else would choke himself just to look nice? That's not weird, said Jenny. That's normal. Try reading a story backward. That's weird. I'm the weird one in the class. Well, that's a laugh, said Rondi. If you're so weird, then how come you never asked Louis to kick you in the teeth? I'm the one who's weird. And I'm the one who's crazy. No, that's not crazy, said Todd. I'll tell you what's crazy. What's crazy is that we all go to school on the 30th floor and the bathrooms are way down on the 1st. Everyone agreed with that, even Mrs. Jules. Benjamin shook his head. What a bunch of weirdos, he thought. Then he smiled. He felt proud to be in a class where nobody was strange because nobody was normal. Oh, this must be your lunch, said Mrs. Jules. She gave Benjamin the white paper sack that had been sitting on her desk since Benjamin's first day. At lunch, Allison headed down the stairs. Mark, she exclaimed. Hi, Allison, said Mark Miller. Long time no see. He carried a white paper sack just like Benjamin's. Allison was afraid she was back on the 19th story. Don't worry, said Mark. Suddenly, everyone realized my name was Mark Miller and not Benjamin Nushmut. And then Miss Zarves gave me this bag and told me to take it to the principal. Is it your lunch? Asked Allison. Look inside, said Mark. He handed her the bag. Allison looked inside. There was an ear. Allison's eyes lit up. Oh, now I get it, she exclaimed. I understand everything. There is no Miss Zarves. See, Mac was talking about the ear. Then Benjamin Nushmut said his name wasn't Mark Miller. So that means you... What? Asked Mark. Allison suddenly looked very confused. Never mind. For just a second, Allison thought she understood everything, but then she lost it. This story's getting crazier and crazier. All right, I will be reading chapter 30 before the end of the day, and I'll also send that out to you so that we'll be all caught up and ready for our watch party, which will be Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. We'll be watching Wayside School, and you should have your popcorn ready, and we'll be on Zoom at 8 o'clock. Okay? Parker, tell them bye. Look, tell them bye.